Welcome back to the deep dive. And, usually when you pull up an audio biography source profile on, like, a medieval monk, you expect a certain kind of, I don't know, quiet.
Yeah, you definitely picture like a guy sitting in a cold, silent cloister somewhere.
Right, just copying dusty manuscripts for 50 years until he peacefully passes away. It's a very static, peaceful image.
Oh, absolutely.
But, well, the sources you brought us today on Saint John Gualbert, or Giovanni Gualberto in Italian, they throw that peaceful image completely out the window.
They really do.
Instead of a quiet cloister, we're starting our deep dive in a dark, narrow alleyway in 11th century Italy with this heavily armed aristocrat who is culturally obligated to commit a murder.
It really is, it's a medieval thriller. I mean,
Yeah.
we are looking at a life defined by violent aristocratic vendettas, these dramatic confrontations, literal trials by fire, and the eventual founding of an elite tree-planting monastic order.
Tree planting, so wild.
Right. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we are examining how one radical, almost unthinkable moment of mercy can completely alter the socio-political and even the physical landscape of an entire era.
Yeah, so let's just drop right into 11th century Florence. So John was born around the year 985 in the castle of Poggio Pettorio. He comes from the Visdomini family, who are this highly influential nobility. And looking at his early years, he was essentially, well, he was a medieval trust fund kid.
That is the perfect way to put it.
Right. He was vain, obsessed with frivolous amusements, romantic intrigues, fine clothes, you name it.
Yeah, but, he was a product of his environment. He was raised to be a soldier, trained in arms, and steeped in a very, very specific aristocratic honor culture.
Like a gang, almost.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, in the year 1000, Florence wasn't the center of Renaissance art that we think of today. It was a rough, feudal society. Centralized justice was just incredibly weak.
Which brings up a critical point about the inciting incident of his life. So, John's only brother, Ugo, is treacherously murdered by a rival. And John publicly vows before God and everyone he knows that he is going to hunt down this assassin and kill him.
Exactly.
But wait, to our modern ears, that sounds like pure vigilantism. But from my reading of the sources you provided, this wasn't just a personal choice, was it?
Not at all. And this raises an important question about how justice actually functioned back then. Because there wasn't, a strong police force or a reliable state court system, justice was completely privatized.
Okay.
It was handled family to family. If a member of your noble house was murdered and you did not retaliate, you weren't viewed as the bigger person. You were viewed as weak.
Wow, so you'd actually be putting a target on your own back.
Precisely. Your entire family would become a target for rival houses because you had just demonstrated that you wouldn't defend your own blood.
So retaliation is basically a survival mechanism for his entire family.
Yes. Securing vengeance was a societal, legal, and moral duty for a nobleman. If John had simply forgiven his brother's killer right away, he would have brought total ruin and shame upon the Visdomini name. His vow of vengeance was really the only culturally acceptable response.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this cultural pressure is what makes the turning point of his life so wild.
Right.
Because later on, he becomes known in art and literature as the Merciful Knight, which is an epithet completely at odds with that violent culture you just described.
It is. The clash between what society demands of him and what actually happens is what makes this moment so historically fascinating.
Let's set that scene, because it plays out like a movie. It's Good Friday. John is riding heavily armed through Florence with his retinue of soldiers. He turns down a narrow, winding alleyway, the kind where you can't easily turn a horse around. And suddenly, he corners his brother's killer.
Just out of nowhere.
Right. And the killer is completely alone, unarmed, and trapped. John draws his sword.
The psychological pressure here is just immense. Every single instinct John has, his years of military training, his profound grief over his murdered brother, and the crushing weight of his family's honor is all funneling into this one violent action.
But the killer does something incredibly specific. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't try to run.
No.
He drops to his knees, stretches his arms out wide to form a human cross, and begs for mercy specifically in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
He reminds John that it is Good Friday-like, the exact day Christ died for sinners.
The brilliant, desperate move. The killer essentially weaponizes John's own underlying faith against him.
Wow, yeah.
He uses the exact physical posture of the crucifixion on the exact liturgical day commemorating the crucifixion to force John to look at what his religion actually demands versus what his culture demands.
And John breaks. The sources say he literally lowers his sword, steps forward, and physically embraces the man.
It's stunning.
He says, "I cannot refuse what you ask in Christ's name. I grant you your life, and I give you my friendship." He completely forgives him and just lets him walk away.
Which means he essentially commits social suicide right there in that alleyway.
Oh.
By dropping that sword, he rejects the entire feudal honor system. And the immediate aftermath proves how violently this internal shift impacts him.
Because he goes straight to the nearby Benedictine church at San Miniato a Monte. He kneels before a crucifix, and according to the historical accounts, the figure of Christ on the cross miraculously bows its head to him, acknowledging this incredible act of mercy.
And that moment of divine validation is crucial because it cements his break from society.
Right, he needed that sign.
Exactly. The physical bowing of the crucifix serves as the ultimate proof to John that choosing mercy over vengeance was the right path, regardless of what his noble peers might say.
And he acts fast. He doesn't even go home to pack a bag. He cuts off his hair, borrows a ratty old monastic habit, and joins the monks right then and there.
Just immediately.
Yeah. His father actually storms the monastery with a mob, completely furious that the heir to the Vis Domini fortune is throwing his life away. But when he sees how utterly unshakable John is, the father actually breaks down and gives him his blessing.
Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot in his life. Because you might assume that John has now entered that quiet, dusty cloister phase we talked about earlier. Like the angry knight becomes a peaceful monk.
But that's not what happens at all. He really just traded physical warfare for institutional warfare, didn't he?
He absolutely did. Because the 11th century church was deeply, deeply entangled with the feudal power structures John had just rejected. The primary plague of the era was something called simony.
Yeah, I see that term all over these sources. Simony is the buying and selling of church offices, right?
Yes. In the Middle Ages, becoming an abbot or a bishop wasn't just a spiritual role. It was a massive economic and political appointment.
Oh, I see.
Bishops controlled vast tracts of land, they collected heavy taxes, and they even commanded private armies.
So wealthy noblemen were basically just buying these titles as real estate investments.
Exactly. They would bribe the local rulers or the pope to get appointed. It meant the church hierarchy was largely populated by corrupt, wealthy aristocrats who cared very little about religion and, well, very much about power.
And John, having just abandoned all his wealth and aristocratic privilege for a pure spiritual life, discovers that his own abbot, a man named Oberto, and the Bishop of Florence himself, Pietro Mezzabarba, both bought their jobs. They're totally guilty of simony.
And for a man who just radically altered his entire existence based on a commitment to truth, this hypocrisy is intolerable. He simply cannot function in a corrupted system.
So he bails. Around the year 1036, he heads up into the Apennine Mountains to a rugged, shaded valley called Vallombrosa, and he starts his own foundation based on the rule of St. Benedict, but he makes it incredibly severe. He institutes perpetual silence, extreme poverty, and zero compromise with secular authorities.
And to pull off that level of strictness, he actually had to innovate. This is where John reveals a kind of structural genius.
Yeah, I was looking at how he organized this, and it feels remarkably modern. The sources mention he essentially invented the modern concept of lay brothers or conversian.
Right.
It reminds me of like a tech startup realizing they need to separate the creatives from the operations team so the creatives can actually focus on building the product without worrying about payroll.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. To understand why this was necessary, you have to understand the divine office.
Okay, what is that exactly?
The divine office is the rigorous daily cycle of communal prayers and psalm singing that monks are required to perform. We are talking 7 or 8 times a day, starting in the middle of the night.
Wow. Yeah, you can't exactly run a massive agricultural estate if you have to drop your plow every 3 hours to go sing in the chapel.
Exactly. Before John, monasteries constantly struggled with this balance. They needed farms to survive, but the manual labor distracted from the intense spiritual contemplation.
So that's where the lay brothers come in.
Yes, John brings in the lay brothers, the conversi. These were often illiterate, deeply pious men who took vows, but they were not required to read Latin or sing the divine office.
They were the operations team.
Yes. They managed the secular business, ran the farms, and handled the economy of the monastery. This allowed the choir monks to be 100% pure contemplatives.
That's super smart.
It was an incredibly efficient economic and spiritual engine that allowed Vallombrosa to thrive without compromising its severe purity.
But this growing pure movement up in the mountains put a massive target on his back, right? Because the corrupt bishop of Florence, Pietro Mezzabarba, is still down in the city,
Right.
and John actively campaigns to get him removed. And the climax of this conflict is completely wild. It's the trial by fire.
What's fascinating here is the trial by fire is a perfect example of how medieval legal and spiritual disputes were settled when standard courts failed.
Wait, explain the mechanics of this for me.
Yeah.
How does a trial by fire actually work legally?
So it falls into the concept of the judicium Dei, or the judgment of God. In an era before standardized jury trials or, forensic evidence, if two parties were locked in an unresolvable dispute.
Like John claiming the bishop was illegitimate and the bishop denying it.
Exactly. They believed God would intervene to protect the innocent party from physical harm.
So they essentially force a miracle to prove a legal point.
Yes. In 1068, John needs undeniable proof for the people of Florence that the bishop is corrupt. So one of John's monks, Peter Igneous, undergoes this ordeal.
Okay.
They build two massive blazing walls of burning wood in a public square in Florence, leaving only a very narrow path between them.
And Peter just walks right through the flames in front of a massive crowd.
He walks right through the inferno, and according to the historical record, he emerges completely unscathed. Not even his clothes are singed.
That is insane. The psychological impact of seeing that in the 11th century must have been staggering.
It broke the bishop's power entirely. The public spectacle served as undeniable, divine proof that John's reform movement was legitimate.
Although the corrupt factions were so furious, they actually burned down one of John's other monasteries, San Salvi, and physically attacked his monks.
Yeah, they didn't go down without a fight.
But John ultimately wins the ideological war. He earns the deep respect of reform-minded popes like Leo IX and Gregory VII, who actually use his Vallombrosan monks as shock troops to clean up the church.
And amidst all this, alongside all this intense political and institutional warfare, John leaves behind this incredible environmental legacy.
Yes. This is one of my favorite details in the sources. Most monasteries cleared forests to plant traditional vegetable gardens or wheat fields, but John had his monks plant trees. They planted vast, sprawling forests of firs and pines throughout the Apennine Mountains. Why did they do that?
Well, it was a mix of practical economics and spiritual philosophy. The soil in those high mountain valleys wasn't great for traditional agriculture.
Too rocky, probably.
Exactly. But it was perfect for silviculture forest management. The monks could sustainably harvest timber, which was a massive commodity for building in nearby Florence. But spiritually, the deep, silent forest mirrored John's desire for contemplative isolation. The physical environment literally reflected their theology.
And they were practicing sustainable forestry centuries before it was a recognized science. Because of this, Pope Pius XII in 1951 officially named Saint John Gualbert the patron saint of foresters, park rangers, and the Italian Forest Corps.
His monks literally shaped the ecology of the entire Italian region.
Oh, and just a wild connection I noticed in the texts centuries after John died. Galilei actually spent time as a novice at Vallombrosa.
Wait, Galileo?
Yeah, he received part of his early education in the exact monastic system John built.
It just shows you the enduring intellectual and cultural weight of this order. It wasn't just a fleeting movement, it became a cornerstone of Tuscan society.
So what does this all mean for John personally? We have a man fighting bishops, advising popes, managing sprawling forest economies, and navigating these massive institutional battles. Did all of this political maneuvering diminish his inner spiritual life? Did he just become, a politician wearing a monk's habit?
That is the eternal risk for any reformer. But the source documents indicate his spiritual life actually deepened. As his public battles intensified, the accounts of mystical phenomena surrounding him multiplied.
Yeah, the supernatural elements are super striking. For example, his primary spiritual tool wasn't the crucifix, which is surprising since a crucifix is what initiated his conversion.
Right.
He specifically carried a wooden hand cross.
Yes, and that hand cross became famous as an active weapon against spiritual darkness. The sources detail how he used it to successfully exorcise demoniacs. This wasn't just a symbolic piece of wood, it was viewed by his contemporaries as an instrument of literal spiritual warfare.
And the sources you gave us are packed with other miracles during his lifetime, too. During a severe regional famine, John reportedly multiplied bread so his monks and the local poor wouldn't starve. His prayers were said to stop raging wildfires and bring rain during massive droughts. There are even accounts of wild animals approaching him in the forest without any fear.
which, these accounts are classic features of what we call hagiography.
Can you define hagiography for those of you listening who might not know?
Certainly. Hagiography refers to the historical writings and biographies of holy people or saints. In medieval hagiography, when you see stories of a person multiplying food, controlling the weather, or living peacefully with wild beasts, the writer is signaling that this person has returned to a state of Edenic grace.
Oh, I see.
The natural world is basically responding to their inherent holiness.
But there is one miracle story that really caught my eye because it feels like a direct thematic callback to his origin story in the Alleyway.
Oh, the paralyzed monk.
Yeah. So there was a monk in his order who was completely paralyzed, but this monk was also harboring a deep, bitter grudge against an enemy. He stubbornly refused to forgive this person.
Right, and John confronts the paralyzed monk and essentially tells him, you have to let this go. The spiritual bitterness is tied directly to your physical state.
And when the monk finally relents, when he truly repents and forgives his enemy in his heart, he is instantly healed of his physical paralysis.
It perfectly mirrors John's own experience with his brother's killer. The physical release only follows the spiritual release. It drives home John's core philosophy. Holding on to vengeance paralyzes the soul. And mercy is the only path to true freedom, both physical and spiritual.
Which brings us to the end of his life. How does a man who lived with such intense supernatural and political friction finally pass away?
Well, he lived a remarkably long life, especially for the 11th century. He died at the age of 88 on July 12, 1073, at the monastery of Badia di Passiano.
And the accounts of his final moments, what the texts refer to as his transitus, or his transition from earthly life to death, are deeply mystical.
The transitus is often a focal point in these biographies. Witnesses at Passignano reported hearing angels singing around his deathbed, and they described the room filling with an overwhelming, powerful fragrance, which is a traditional marker of saintly purity.
And the church didn't wait long to recognize him either. He was canonized in 1193 by Pope Celestine III, which is exactly 120 years after his death. In the grand scheme of Catholic canonizations, that is a fairly rapid timeline.
It reflects how undeniable his impact was. He wasn't some obscure hermit. He was a very public architect of church reform.
And here's where it gets really interesting regarding his physical remains, his relics. He was buried at Passignano, which quickly became a massive pilgrimage site.
Right.
But his body didn't entirely stay there. If you go to the Abbey of Vallombrosa today, they preserve an incredibly lavish reliquary, crafted in the year 1500 by the famous Florentine goldsmith Paolo Sodiano. And housed inside that intricate gold and silver masterpiece is Saint John Gualbert's right arm.
The fact that Florence commissioned a master goldsmith to enshrine his arm over 400 years after his death highlights just how central his legacy remained to the identity of the city.
It really is an incredible journey. I mean, we started with a violent, heavily armed aristocrat in a dark alley, culturally bound to commit a murder.
Yeah.
And we end with a tree-planting, corruption-fighting saint who revolutionized monastic economics, whose very arm is preserved in gold. He literally dropped his sword, and in doing so ended up reshaping the medieval church and the physical ecology of Italy.
It is a profound narrative.
Yeah.
And I think the core takeaway for you, listening to this, is that true leadership and systemic reform almost always require us to first conquer our own most deeply ingrained cultural expectations.
Yeah.
John couldn't fight the systemic corruption of the church until he first defeated the systemic violence in his own heart.
He had to drop the sword first before he could pick up the cross.
Exactly. And this raises an important question about how we view mercy. We often think of forgiveness as a passive act. We think of it as just letting something go, like a quiet internal surrender where you just decide not to be angry anymore.
Right.
But in John Gualbert's case, dropping his sword in that alleyway was the most aggressive, history-altering action of his entire life.
It wasn't passive at all.
Not in the slightest. That single, shocking act of mercy birthed an entire monastic order. It fundamentally altered the environmental landscape of the Apennine Mountains by planting vast forests. And it created the institutional leverage needed to root out deeply entrenched systemic corruption in the highest levels of the medieval church.
That really changed the world.
It did. And it leaves us with a provocative thought to mull over today. What systemic, real-world changes might be waiting on the other side of a personal grudge you are holding on to right now?
What an incredible question to leave off on. Thank you for bringing these amazing sources to the table for us to explore. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into a life that changed history. Until next time.